welcome to the CCDA podcast. My name is Roslyn Hernández. I am the podcast producer at Chasing Justice, and I'm also helping lead the Indigenous Peoples Network at CCDA. Today, I am joined by a very special guest, Carol Bremer-Bennett, the U.S. Executive Director at World Renew. And World Renew is an organization that partners with local churches and organizations around the world to bring life-changing programs that transform communities in every area of need. Carol, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thank you. It's great to be here.
So can you tell us a little bit about the work that you've done, how you have come to this position at World Renew?
Absolutely. First of all, let me introduce myself. She'e Carol Bremer-Bennett Yenishe, Todich'iinii Nishle, Todich'iinii Basischiin. My clans are the Water Flows Together people and the Bitter Water people from the Dene people, which is the Navajo Nation of the great southwest of this country. And I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Three Fires Council in West Michigan, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, as I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, as I serve as the U.S. Director for World Renew. And in that acknowledgement, I just always want to make sure that I pay respects to elders, both past and present, and also make sure that I acknowledge and praise our Creator God for how those people have stewarded this land throughout time and generations. And in all things, that we're aware of the beauty in the places that we're at, in the sacred spaces that are still visible today, and thankful and come with hearts of gratitude for that. So thank you for having me and having a conversation today. I hope that we can find places where our ancestors have intersected with one another and where our stories come together in conflict or in harmony. And that as God has called us, that we are ambassadors and reconcilers throughout the work that we do. And I just pray for the Spirit of God to move in us and surround us in His beauty today. So World Renew, as you said, is a Christian organization that works in about 30 countries around the world, give or take, as we respond to disasters and work in the humanitarian sector, but also do work in that long-term community development work. And we are committed to living out a call to God's justice, to mercy, and to compassion. And our work calls us to partner with local communities and local churches in the various countries where we work so that we can address the issues of justice and disaster and crisis response, and to address poverty and hunger around the world. And so that's a lot of what we do. I think it's important in our work that we live into our theme verse at World Renew, which is Micah 6, verse 8, that I grew up with in the church, knowing that we need to love mercy, that we need to live justly, that we need to seek to walk humbly with God. And so when we enter communities, we try to arrive with questions, not with answers. In my Navajo heritage, there's a very common saying that the Creator gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth for a very specific reason. And so use them in that ratio, in that proportionality, that you're really seeking to listen and to understand. And that's what I love about the posture of World Renew around the world, is that we try to go in with deep listening, with hearts that desire to connect, that we want to walk alongside and do with, not for, as we seek to live out those key aspects of asset-based community development. And then we ask those questions about, what do you have? What's strong here? What are the dreams? And walk alongside people as they envision their own transformation, and we can help support that along the way.
So you mentioned asset-based community development. Can you tell us a little bit more about what it is, how do you live into it, not only as an organization probably, but even just as people who are living in communities? I work with young adults through Chasing Justice who are trying to live faithfully and justly in this world. And asset-based thinking and principles are really important, I think, for not just organizations, but individuals to also have that posture towards the places, the communities that they live in, and even the work that they get to co-labor with other organizations. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. Asset-based community development is a cornerstone for the work of World Renew, and I think it puts us in the correct space as we work to live out this call and this mission. I would say it's about starting with what's strong, not with what's wrong. And so you start in a completely different space. It's a way of seeing people and situations not as problems to be solved, but seeing people as image bearers of God who have that full dignity with gifts and wisdom and agency. And so in practice, when we live into asset-based community development, it means that we are helping communities identify their own assets, whether those be skills or relationships, the traditions and culture, especially the land. All of those things will support them and have supported them for hundreds and thousands of years to build solutions from within their own communities. So for me, what I love about it is that it's deeply respectful, it's intentionally relational, it's deeply rooted, I think, in faith, and has that reciprocity that I think that connects Indigenous communities and cultures together. And so that being a basis really helps us to live out that work. I think it rightly places communities at the center of their own journey and destiny, and it doesn't come in with outside answers from a different place. And so I think that's really important as we live into asset-based community development.
Yeah. Thanks so much for explaining that. I think you mentioned something about, like you come into a space or into a community and you see not what is wrong, but what is strong. And it just kind of reminds me of having a posture of abundance instead of lack, and of seeing that there is creator has created communities and life and people with abundance, with a with cultural wealth, with so much wealth of not just spiritual but also like the faith and even the hardships that people have gone through have built and fostered strength in communities. And so a lot of the times in more Western systems or structures, when communities go through hardships and there is perceived lack, it can be seen as a negative. But I love that, in indigenous cultures and even in cultures that are more or a bit more close to their indigeneity, there is this idea of, hey, we have something to offer, and we have knowledge too, we have wisdom, and we have strength and like cultural wealth and ideas that are interesting and that are helpful for us and that understand our context and our communities, and that can be used to help us create a better place, community, and a better world, not just for us, but for others as well.
It is so true. There is such a richness and a beauty and a strength in communities around the world that sometimes Western ideas and constructs of what success or what life might look like fails to recognize. And so I think asset-based community development really takes the time to recognize the beauty that God has placed in different cultures, and that you talk about that cultural wealth, and I would add that cultural wisdom that's there. And a lot of times what I have seen as I've traveled around the world is that when a community is given a solution that really comes from external sources as the solution for hunger or creating wealth and income, that has often backfired on the community. So, for example, we work a lot in agriculture in World Renew, and so many people were given this idea of becoming, buying into monocrop agriculture, where you farm your fields with maize to have a big cash crop. And the idea is that if you can sell that and have a lot of cash, well, cash is the solution to getting out of poverty. But that has proved to not be the case. We all know how capitalism works, and if everybody suddenly is growing maize, the prices will drop out. Or if you have disease or insect infestation, it also, of course, goes against indigenous wisdom of traditional planting and our knowledge of how the land works and how nutrition works. And we've never been a monocropping society as indigenous people. We've always known that the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, beyond that, is really how the soil needs to regenerate itself. And so World Renew goes back into those ideas of that traditional wisdom and those heirloom crops and seeds to look at how can we get away from ideas that came from the outside that were supposed to be this quick fix solution, but they're really not. They're hurting the community. And of course, the other thing that's happened in monocropping societies, again with maize, is that if that's all that the farmers and families are growing, then that's what they end up feeding their own families, which doesn't have high nutrition value for children. And so we're working to bring back the songs and bring back the wisdom about what traditionally has been grown in those areas so that the nutrition can be complete for children as well.
Yeah, and with monoculture, like in that example they gave with the maize, if you keep subtracting those nutrients from the land because you keep planting the same crop, you're depleting the earth from nutrients. And so after several years, even the earth, even the soil is not healthy enough to keep producing. And then you get droughts, or like you get, you know, it creates other problems that are harder to fix.
It absolutely does. It absolutely does. And so, going back to the wisdom of the elders to look at how do you rotate crops? How do you use green manure, cover crops? How do you use composting and other aspects and find those heirloom seeds and go back to things that were seen as not, that were staples of the society, but they were somehow, told, well, growing millet is not good, it's not something you should be eating or whatever, and going back and really looking at that and reviving the recipes for the families and the mothers to recognize how they can increase the nutrition of their children with diversity within the nutrition. So it's a very holistic approach, and that's just one example from agriculture, but there's many other areas too that World Renew works that takes on that holistic approach so that you can go back into what was some of the wisdom of the community that may have been lost over time and diluted, or even, told, well, this is the wrong way to do it. You got to do it this way if you really want to develop, if you really want to, work your way out of poverty or address the hunger that's in your community.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, for those examples. I'm wondering about your journey as an Indigenous woman. Can you share about a little bit about like your leadership journey, how you have come to do the work that you do, but also just how has it been, not just being a woman, which is, as we know, already more difficult than if a man was a leader, but like being an Indigenous woman, how has that been for you?
Yeah, thank you for that. It's an honored and a sacred space for me. It can also be lonely and isolating because there's not, in the global community where I work as a leader of an international NGO in the humanitarian and development sector, I don't meet a lot of true peers who are also Indigenous women. And so that can be a bit isolating. In my own journey, I didn't start out in this sector. I certainly studied this when I was in university. And I majored in political science and I minored in economics and theology. I had my heart and eye on working in some kind of international development work. But God took me on a bit of a detour to reconnect with my Navajo heritage. And so I ended up, after university here in West Michigan, going to the Navajo Nation and volunteering for the first little bit, but then working at a Christian school in Gallup, New Mexico, and became a teacher. And such a joy. I found my special niche in working with middle school students and still have a great big place in my heart for middle school boys, and just really loved that work. And then also grew into administration and then ended up becoming an executive director and superintendent of a school in New Mexico that served primarily Navajo students and Zuni, as well as some other indigenous students of New Mexico and Arizona, and of course others in the community too, as well as Hispanics and Anglo students. So that's where my love of education really grew. And a lot of what Worldly New does is walking alongside people in their knowledge journey and gathering new wisdom and insight and transforming their lives. So I got to do that with students. But when you work in an area like New Mexico and the Navajo Nation, which is one of the areas in our country that experiences incredibly high rates of unemployment, has many people who are living below the national poverty levels, who are working to address generational trauma and historic oppression and systems that were exported from outside that are still reign and rule quite a bit as we exist as sovereign nations within a larger nation. You find that you don't end up just working with the students. You end up working with the parents and with the grandmothers and the aunties and the uncles, and it becomes a true community endeavor. And so I think that's where my connection and love for the power of community really took root. And I saw how much you can't just say, here's school, it happens from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. and then you're done. I had a favorite saying when I was a superintendent and a middle school principal and so forth, to say, my school goes home at night. School is not a building or an institution, it's a community. And they go home at night, and they're not just students, they're children, they're grandchildren, they're cousins, and so you need to make sure that you continue to see and love and meet each person where they're at along the way. And I think that's the beauty of what I get to do now in World Renew as I lead this organization, which I made that jump almost 10 years ago now. In a few weeks, it'll be 10 years that I've been leading World Renew. That kind of participatory education, where you place the learner at the center, where you recognize that it takes an entire community to transform even one person within the community, that continues on. And so it's been a real pleasure to make that switch in my career, but to see how much similarity there is in what I did as an educator and what I do now as an executive director of an international NGO. I think the other great joy that I have in my work is certainly the fact that it's a Christian organization. I continue to be able to give testimony to the goodness of God and his creation, to address the brokenness and the way it's not supposed to be, and to work for that. But also the fact that so much of the work that we do in World Renew is with Indigenous communities, with communities that within their own country contexts have been oppressed and marginalized, and who show such great strength. I have an unrealized dream to connect people from the Navajo Nation with indigenous groups in Guatemala or Honduras or the Rohingya in Bangladesh, to have them learn from one another. I think as I go forward and perhaps change and have another chapter in my career, that might be something that I really work towards, is to gather Indigenous people together. There's so much that can be learned and inspired from one another. I also have left some places around the world. I remember flying out of Kilimanjaro on one of my earliest trips to Tanzania, and I wept. I wept because I saw such incredible power in the transformation in the communities that I had visited. But I wept because I saw more happening there than I did in my own Navajo Nation. And I thought, I've struggled over the years with thinking, why can that, how can that be? Here sits the Navajo Nation within one of the wealthiest, most powerful nations in the world, and yet they're not experiencing the kind of transformation that I'm seeing in a very remote community in Tanzania or Western Zambia. And so I've struggled with that. And what's my role as a Navajo leader in that? And what can I do to affect that change?
Yeah, thanks so much for naming those tensions. I and you named like you had to you your detour was reconnecting with your Dene culture and working within the Navajo Nation as a teacher. I'm I identify as someone who's reconnecting with her indigenous roots. My parents are from Puebla, Mexico, and we have ancestry from Mixteco and Nahua peoples in Mexico. And so, for someone like me who's second generation, born in the United States, lived in Mexico for a while, came back to the U.S., I first of all didn't have much connection to my grandparents, to like elders in my immediate family. So I didn't really grow up knowing the history of our people or of our family. So it's been a lot of work to learn about not just my family, but also where we come from, like the places, the cultures, and so many of those things that have been villainized or have been demonized by Christianity that comes from a Western posture and stance that sees indigenous spirituality or even just indigenous thought as or out of orthodoxy. So, can you name a little bit about like what was it like for you to do the work of reconnecting? You obviously went to a place where the culture was strong. What
Yeah.
maybe advice you have for people like me who don't have that kind of connection or whose roots are very far and are trying to do the work of reconnecting or even just decolonizing the way that we have grown up or and even our faith?
Yeah. It takes courage to go into those spaces, because people and just the busyness of life will try to stand and put up obstacles and all the reasons why not to, and our own personal fears and discomfort can play into that. But I applaud you starting that journey and encourage you and anyone else to go for it. It's a hard space, but it's so important to understand your God-given identity. I think it's answering really the call of God to not just be still and know that I am God, but know that I've created you as a beloved daughter of mine. Go forth, child, find that out, celebrate that. I think God smiles and takes such delight in the incredible diversity that the Creator has put into this world, and that we're denying the Creator some delight if we are not paying attention and connecting to it. So I would just simply encourage people to take that step. It is a step of courage, and it's not easy. I spent many times walking the red hills in New Mexico, trying to figure out, who am I and how do I fit here? I feel called, but I feel the obstacles. And when you've been cut off from your elders and those connections, getting to know what your clan connections are, getting to understand parts of the culture that you were never taught. And if you have the Christianity in the mix, sometimes Christianity has said, those things are no longer okay to teach or to talk about, and trying to understand what can we redeem? Where can we find God's beautiful revelation through creation in culture, and how can we redeem that? I think that Jesus opens up and tore the curtain, not just access just for us to access Jesus as our Savior and Redeemer, but to say all peoples, all peoples now have access. And it's not just for one people group, and it doesn't have to be just in one way. I think the beauty of the Creator is that there's so many cultures that have been part of God's creation. But I spent many, many times in that wandering space, and with tears rolling down my face, sometimes alone, sometimes with others, trying to figure out identity, believing that if I choose one part of my identity, that somehow I have to, look away and walk away from another part of my identity. And I think a lot of times the Western world and Christianity can put us in that dualistic space where it's either or. You don't get both ands. You don't get the circle. There's lines drawn rather than circles created. And I think you have to do some hard work to say, no, actually, look at God. Look at how the Creator is so complex that so many things can be true all at once, and to really embrace your fullness of self, just as God takes you and embraces that. So I guess that would be my encouragement. I think at one point I thought that I had to deny part of my identity in order to embrace my Indigenous identity, and then I realized that no, actually, God pulls that all together and puts my identity as His beloved daughter first, and then I used to say, well, then the other identities fell away, but they didn't actually fall away because they fell into place, and I felt whole and complete in knowing that.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I feel like you've expressed so much of what I have been kind of coming to realize. I definitely, for me, this journey, or this part of the journey for me, has felt like becoming whole again. And like you mentioned, and there might be stages and different aspects of the journey that people might experience as they go through this. But certainly, yes, there's a lot of emotions that come up. There is sadness, there is anger, there is isolation, and there is like a yearning for community, and even like a reaching out for community and ancestry and heritage. And in all of that, you do reach a point of what I would call integration, that we don't deny parts of ourselves, that we, as we become whole, we learn to see how they all fit together. The oppressor side of our heritage, and the indigenous side or other sides of our heritage. And yeah, so I just thank you so much for making that space, for sharing about it with us. Has there been any change in your leadership as you have stepped more into this kind of posture that you're having, or yeah, any change or experience that has changed you in your leadership?
As you become a seasoned leader, and I can say that I've got my own gray hairs, and I have the privilege of being a grandmother now, that it's essential that you learn and that you adjust. And so some of the things that I might have done as a brazen, some of those things worked out well for me, and some of them had to be deep learning experiences where I had to realize that wasn't the way to handle a certain situation or a conversation. And so I certainly have learned, and I'm still learning. And then you've got to embrace that constant humility that you haven't arrived. You're still God's still working in you, and you're still working. And surround yourself with a variety of elder voices, younger voices, people who hold a different perspective and a different place, and keep those people tight around you in your circle of people who influence and inspire you. So certainly I have had to go through those times, and I think I've learned how essential relationships are and how essential trust and connection is in leadership. I am blessed in World Renew to have amazing leaders alongside me. We actually have a co-directorship model. So I'm the director in the US, I have a co-director in Canada, and together we co-direct the work of World Renew around the world. And I think leaders can become quite isolated, and that's hard on the soul, but it's also harder to become a good leader if you become isolated. So I live with great joy having both a co-director, but also a great global executive team with me at World Renew, where we've really worked on sharing stories, our stories with one another, knowing each other's story paths and understanding how we have intersected and how we have joys and sorrows and experiences in common draw us together, but also realizing how very different our lives have been. And so we truly have taken work to understand that God's given us these different experiences so that we can bring those into the work world and into the ministry, so that we challenge each other. We work on productive conflict and making sure that we're looking and even mining for conflict and for different ideas so that we can really achieve great results together. And I think as a leader, I sometimes skip those early steps of taking time to hear each other's stories and to build up that trust relationship as the base. And I've learned that those steps can never be skipped. And so I think that's one of my greatest developments. I also have learned how to apologize and own my own errors and missteps, but also own ones that perhaps I didn't directly cause, but as the leader of an organization, you are responsible for everything that happens within the organization. And I am honest with my staff when mistakes have been made. And I am not above apologizing and committing over and over again to learning and to being better and to showing up more for the staff, for the partners and communities that we work with along the way.
Thanks so much for sharing that. It's a model of leadership that is not very common, but I hope that we can have more of leadership like that. You mentioned you're in Grand Rapids, and you have a co-director in Canada. Can you tell us, the conference that's coming up for CCDA is in Grand Rapids in November. What do you wish people knew about Grand Rapids as we're getting ready to head over there with you?
Yeah, well, we are ready and we'll receive you with welcome arms. We're so excited and honored that the CCDA conference is coming to Grand Rapids in November. You're going to find it to be a lovely place. The conference will be downtown along our river, which is why, of course, we're named Grand Rapids. And I think that cities that have rivers flowing through them are some of the most beautiful and delightful cities around the world. And so we're ready to have you here. Grand Rapids is a place that has often hit different lists and charts of great places to tour, and we hit some great charts as far as places to live and to work and to raise a family. And it's interesting to me because I lived here for a long time to see your hometown in a way, because I did grow up in Grand Rapids, even though I lived in New Mexico for 25 years. To see it on that list and you're like, oh, that's an interesting perspective, because sometimes when it's your own backyard, you
Yeah.
forget the beauty that's there. So there's a lot of beauty around Grand Rapids. We have we have a great amount of community and business, I would say, investment into the community and the place that we desire to be. It's an innovative entrepreneurial city with just some really great people who are leaders in our community, from our mayor, who is a friend of mine, to different business owners that I highly respect and have worked with in the Grand Rapids Chamber of Commerce, to our other politicians. My own senator from the state of Michigan lives across the street from me. So it's a city that is still small enough that there's lots of overlap and connections. And so I think people are going to really delight in that. And we have some things that we're well known for, including the Frederick Meyer Gardens, which is once again gotten, I think, the top sculpture park award for the nation, if not beyond our nation. And so there's some great things to visit. But like all cities, there's the hard stories too. In all the things that you celebrate, it's important not to forget the history. I have a friend who's working in a small effort to make sure that we're documenting the African American story of Grand Rapids. And there's a very small museum that has started to try to tell that story. The African Americans within our community are certainly still living out the reality of the redlining that happened, and the discrimination and the injustices and the lack of access to be business owners, to be homeowners, to have the same full rights and privileges as others in the community. And then if you go back even further, the very beautiful river that has lots of the downtown development around, you can go to the park that is right next to the Gerald R. Ford Museum downtown and learn a bit about the Indigenous history there. And, you know, years ago, when it was determined that that was important land to have for the furniture industry that built up Grand Rapids, we used to be known as Furniture City, that caused the displacement of Indigenous people who relied on the river as their source of water and for agriculture, for connection, for fishing. And so, there are parts of our history that we still need to face and tell and understand that there are still people groups that are affected by the way a city can grow up and displace and not pay attention to all of its people groups.
Yeah, well, it's important that you name that. There's work being done to recognize what has been done that wasn't good for Indigenous peoples or other cultural or ethnic groups that have come in. And in that work of that's being done, the conference theme for this year is shalom. So I see a little bit of shalom work being done in there, but is there any other way that you see shalom being done either in your work at World Renew or in the city of Grand Rapids?
Absolutely. I think the other thing that Grand Rapids is known for is sort of having a church on every corner, which isn't literally true, but there are a lot of churches here. And the churches have found ways to come together. And CCDA is one of the places and organizations that has created space for churches and congregants to come together to say, what can we do differently here? What can we learn from each other here? And so I see that desire to have our faith walk out into the streets and become action for our local community is a great desire, and something that many churches and citizens of Grand Rapids really desire. And so that gives me a lot of hope that there's an awareness that we need to seek justice and seek reconciliation and be an active part of that. So I see that in lots of different ways in the community. There are scores of nonprofits and ministries that are addressing all the different range of areas that injustice and the brokenness of systems and the oppression of people can manifest itself. And I have women's groups and other network circles that pull people in so that we can support one another, because as much as the great work is happening and getting momentum and a footing and making transformation, it still can be a hard go. It still can be a hard go. And so we need each other. We need to encourage one another and find spaces where we can pray for one another and learn. Even if we're working in different areas of focus, there's still commonality that brings us together. I love the fact that the theme is shalom. I did have a little bit of like advocating for something about justice rolling like a river, because I was thinking of our river. But when I heard that the conference theme was shalom, I said, okay, God, what are you trying to say to me? Because I am one of these people who does choose a word in January that I try to live into, and that I say, okay, Lord, how are you going to use this word for me? And so last year, my word was hope. This year, my word is hojo, which is the Navajo word for balance and harmony, and the most equivalent idea for the concept of hojo in Navajo that I could find in the Bible would be shalom. Hojo in the Navajo thinking calls us into looking what is beautiful before us, what is beautiful behind us, what is beautiful above and below, so that we can walk in that beauty. And it talks about living in a manner that strives to create and maintain balance and harmony and order. So it's really about deep connection to yourself, to people, to the land, and to Creator and the Redeemer and the Spirit. Because we can't have that beauty if we don't have that connection. And so I think that the biblical idea of shalom is closely connected into that. It's an already but not yet idea. It's this original goodness that God, the Creator, put into this world that is there and yet is broken and is crying out to be redeemed. And so I love that the concept is shalom, because I think it grounds us into the way God desires and created things to be, but it also inspires and is an aspiration of how more fully we could achieve that, even in this day, that we're not waiting just for Jesus' return, although I pray for Jesus' return often. Yet I know that I'm called to walk in this day and on this land and with these people and in this sacred space, to work for shalom, to work for hojo, not just individually, but as a community.
Oh, thanks. And so the last question that we ask in every episode is, how do you see the CCDA philosophy at work in your community?
Yeah, there's such a richness to CCDA. I know that it started out with some basic concepts. I think they had to do with reconciliation and maybe redistribution, relocation. I think about it as this connection that into all the parts. And so I think that the way that I see CCDA in Grand Rapids is people working to restore and reconcile things for the good of the community, recognizing that we are in relationships that demand connection and reciprocity, and that just like the land, one aspect of our community that is not doing well is going to affect a greater field and affect the productivity and the harvest of that. And so, as a community, we're like an ecosystem that needs to come together. And so, I celebrate the ways that the people in Grand Rapids are investing in affordable housing, that are looking. I have friends who, and my own church, who are still, even in the current context, we're still very committed to welcoming the foreigner and housing and welcoming refugee families, organizing for food justice, helping people to become homeowners and stay in their communities that have rooted and grown up generations. And so I see that happening in Grand Rapids, and I see that happening. I always believe that one of the beautiful things about working for an international NGO is that you can bring people into a different place around the world where they can see the power of transformation and the power of community, the power of working with asset-based community development. And they take that and they bring it back into their own communities. And so they rethink, okay, how do we rethink being a deacon in my congregation? How do we rethink Christmas baskets or food banks? How can we do that where we center the dignity of a person and a parent into that rather than centering ourselves, trying to dispel and to really acknowledge, where have I adopted a savior complex, and in many cases a white savior complex, and how can I further my understanding so that I'm not at the center of what feels good to do here, but actually center somebody else into this transformative journey. And so I love that that happens, that people who are attuned to doing that already in their communities often go globally and see something more fully and add to that conversation and wisdom, but they also perhaps come back into their community and see new ways to work on that locally. And that's beautiful. I think the CCDA philosophy is rooted in proximity and presence. It's rooted in empowerment and reconciliation. And that's not just something for the United States. That's a kingdom vision. It's a global vision. And we're honored at World Renew to be a part of CCDA and to be a part of that transformative story.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing your journey into leadership, your own journey and your identity, cultural and ethnic identity, and for sharing about your hometown, for sharing about your community. We're really looking forward to seeing you in Grand Rapids for anyone who's going. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing today.
Absolutely. Hey, it's been an honor and a privilege, and we look forward to having you all join us in Grand Rapids in November.
Yay. Awesome. Well, thank you for listening to the CCDA podcast, and thank you, Carol, for joining us today. If you want to learn more about World Renew, CCDA's Indigenous Network, or the CCDA Conference, check out the show notes. Check out the show notes of this episode. This episode is produced by Sarah Callan in association with Christina Four. We will be back soon with another episode featuring CCDA practitioners who are committed to seeing people and communities experience God's shalom. We'll see you then.